Mark's Dollhouse by Ron Ripley. What is it? Cheryl asked. Mark looked at his sister with disgust. Come on, what does it look like? He snapped as she shied away from the anger in his voice. Like a dollhouse, Cheryl answered in a hushed tone. Exactly, Mark said. That's what it is. You're so damn stupid. She looked at the floor and didn't defend herself. Mark wanted to add a few more insults, but the cheers. Rerun started at 9, and he didn't want to listen to her cry through the whole 30 minutes of the show. Ignoring her, he turned his attention back to the dollhouse. It was an old Victorian, beautifully painted in grand old, painted lady fashion. The various shades of purple and light blue stood out sharply, each portion highlighted by brilliant cornices of white. Through the slate roof, a tall and powerful chimney projected. He looked at it, and Mark imagined he could smell the rich, potent scent of a fireplace. He took a step back and admired his purchase while Cheryl hovered a few feet away. He glanced at his older sister and wondered how she had ever survived childhood. She didn't, Mark corrected himself. Not really. Vaguely he could remember her falling into the pool and hitting her head on the concrete walkway as she went into the water. His most powerful memory of that day, his 5th birthday, was the way her blood had eased out of the long gash on the side of her head to tint the chlorinated water pink. The injury and subsequent damage by water inhalation had damaged his sister's mental acuity. She'll never be older than a 10-year-old in that head of hers, Mark thought. She was 47. And Mom and Dad saddled me with her, he thought bitterly. He sighed and said, Get me a beer, Cheryl. And a bowl of chips. Mark didn't bother with a please, just like he wouldn't bother with a thank you. She ducked her head and scurried out of the room. My taking care of her and not stuffing her into a home is please and thank you enough. The line was an old line he told his sister and repeated to himself in an effort to make it true. His painful reality was that he lived in his familial home only because he took care of his sister. If he got rid of her, then the trust that the house was in would end, and Mark would find himself penniless and on the street. He took one more appreciative look at the dollhouse, smirked, then went and sat down in his chair. When Cheryl returned, she put the TV tray across the worn arms of his recliner, then placed his beer and snack exactly where he liked them to be. One thing about her, though, Mark thought, pulling the tab on the beer and taking a drink. She sure remembers how to do her chores. As that thought passed through his mind, Cheryl reached out, picked up the remote and turned the TV on. The old tube flickered and warmed up, finally revealing Channel 5, one of the few stations the old Zenith TV received. I need to buy a new one soon, he told himself, as he did every night when he sat down to watch his shows. But he knew he wouldn't, not until the Zenith died or his sister did. He smiled at the idea of her dead and tried to focus on Cheers. Cheryl made it to the second commercial before she asked, What are you going to do with the dollhouse, Mark? He heard the longing in her voice and felt the urge to tease her. He opened his mouth to do just that, then remembered how she had cried for days when he had teased her with an old doll. Gonna sell it, Mark said, and then he let out a long belch to emphasize his point. Usually, Cheryl giggled when he acted like a fool, but when he looked at her to see if he could get any sort of reaction, he saw she was wearing a nervous smile. What? He asked her. Cheryl said, sniffling. Do you think, maybe I could buy it? The question caught him off guard and left him sitting in his chair, shocked. No, he said after a moment. Then he shook his head. No, you sure as hell can't. That thing's going to bring in a couple of $1,000s, sis. You got that much money kicking around that I don't know about? She shook her head, her thin, straw-colored hair flopping lifelessly in front of her moon-shaped face. Yeah, didn't think so, he sneered. Mark watched the end of a commercial for Tide, finished his bowl of chips, and watched the last 5 minutes of his show. When it ended, he stood up, stretched, and scratched unconsciously at his large midsection. He yawned, and turned to see Cheryl by the dollhouse, peering into it. "Hey!" he yelled. She jumped back, a terrified look on her face. "Stay away from my stuff," Mark snarled. "Got it?" Cheryl nodded. She seemed about to say something, but lowered her eyes. "Get out of here," he said in disgust. "Go to bed. I can't look at you anymore tonight." Without a word, Cheryl left the room, pausing in the doorway to gaze lovingly at the dollhouse. "I could give it to her," he thought, then he straightened up in surprise. "The hell I could," he grumbled, wondering where the thought had come from. "That'll be the day. I give her everything already." Mark knew the statement wasn't true, but he liked to think it was. And when he was digging around estate sales and flea markets, it was the lie he told other salvagers. None of them knew him from a hole in the wall, so he could paint himself as the unsung hero of his family. "Which I am," he reminded himself. Mark looked at the dollhouse one last time, memorizing the placement of everything on it should Cheryl decide to play it with it overnight, and then went to his room. He didn't bother brushing his teeth or washing up. He wouldn't be going out for another couple of days, except for food. "I can always send Cheryl down to the corner store. They know who she is now," he thought, yawning. "Yeah, that might be best. Got to figure out how I'm going to sell the damned dollhouse." Mark pushed his way into the bed, moving aside the newspapers from the previous week. He dragged his blankets up and over him, closing his eyes against the ambient light of the various electronics in the room. Multiple digital clocks, old VCRs, DVD players, and an old amplifier all combined to create a dull, pleasant glow that greeted him regardless of the time he woke up. The windows were covered with old sheets and woolen army blankets, keeping the room in perpetual darkness. A soft rustling sound caused him to open his eyes a fraction, and he looked through the open doorway, down the narrow hall. He saw the dollhouse and the shadow it cast on the wall beside it. Mark smiled, imagining the amount of money he could make from its resale. "What a find," he thought. "I can't believe someone was stupid enough to leave this on the side of the road." It had been, sitting pretty, as it were, beneath a large tree on a stretch of road. It was almost as if the house had fallen off a moving van or someone's vehicle. And somehow, it had landed perfectly without damage. He chuckled to himself. "Who cares, I sure as hell don't. It's mine now, and that's it." Mark yawned and waited for sleep to come. A whispering caught his ear and caused his eyes to snap open. Cheryl was near the dollhouse, leaning down and speaking in a whisper he couldn't understand. "Cheryl!" Mark yelled, pushing himself into a sitting position. He winced at the pain of moving his overweight body, and channeled the pain and anger he felt towards his sister. She didn't turn around. "She's not even paying attention to me." It was common for her not to hear him, or to react to stimulus, but it was always frustrating. Mark swung his legs out of bed, got to his feet and staggered tiredly down the hall. "Cheryl," he bellowed and was gratified to see her jerk upright. She twisted around and faced him, her eyes wide and glistening. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. "I was talking," Cheryl whispered, looking down at the floor, wringing her hands. "Talking to a damned dollhouse?" Mark was more incredulous than angry. "Listen, I know you got your problems, but that's too much. Get to bed." Cheryl's eyes flicked up from the floor, darted from him to the dollhouse, then back to him. "I said to get to bed." Mark's anger returned in a rush, and he stepped forward, raising a hand. His sister flinched away, familiar with the pain he was able to deliver with a single blow. She licked her lips nervously, then lowered her chin to her chest and slunk out of the room. Mark shook his head in disbelief, and then peered at the dollhouse, trying to see if she had caused any damage. Nothing looks broken, he thought. He began to turn away but stopped himself. Something's not right. Mark leaned closer and saw the miniature front door was ajar and that a light was coming from inside. Confused, he cautiously pushed the door open wider. He saw that a small wall sconce was illuminated, the tiny bulb casting its glow on the hardwood floor. As he looked at the light, it went out, plunging the dollhouse's hall into darkness. Battery operated? He asked himself. He peered around either side of the building without seeing anything that indicated it was powered by batteries. Mark shook his head, shrugged, and straightened up. I can check it out tomorrow, he thought, suppressing a yawn. Mark walked back to his room, collapsed onto his bed and stared up at the ceiling. Probably should have checked the damn thing out soon as I got it home, he thought. I bet Cheryl thought she did it. And that there really is something in the house. Damn, bet she thinks it's some fairy or some other crap. It'll be like pulling teeth to get her to leave it alone. He rolled onto his side, picked up a half-finished slice of pizza from the night before and took a bite. He chewed it on the right side, avoiding the broken tooth on the left, and considered how he was going to market the dollhouse. Along Route 101 in Amherst, New Hampshire, there were a dozen antique dealers, and any given weekend in the spring he could find buyers from as far away as New York City searching the shops. I could take some pictures, he thought. Print 'em up at the pharmacy and bring 'em with me. He nodded to himself, took another bite, and then tossed the pizza back onto the bed table. He chased it down with a drink of warm Dr. Pepper, belched, and then closed his eyes. He drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally opening his eyes completely to catch sight of the dollhouse. Each time he saw it, the toy stood alone, which was how he wanted it. At 2:01 in the morning, he woke up, observed the solitude of the dollhouse, and closed his eyes again. The sound of voices woke him. They were muffled, joking and laughing. At first, Mark thought he was dreaming, the darkness in his room too absolute. Then, he realized that the bedroom door was closed, and it was only 2:16. What was that? He wondered. Mark got out of bed, gripped the doorknob, and tore the door open. All the lights were on in the dollhouse, and his sister sat on the floor in front of it, her back to him. He stomped down the hallway, old family photographs rattling on their hooks with every angry step he took. Mark reached down, grabbed Cheryl by the shoulder, and turned her around violently. She stared at him with wide, surprised eyes. Mark, she said, and he silenced her with a backhand slap across her face. Blood sprayed from freshly split lips and he felt her teeth cut into the knuckles of his hand. What did I tell you? He screamed. Huh? I didn't touch anything, she wailed, holding her hands up to her face. Even through his anger, he could see the truth on her face, hear it in her words. Cheryl never lied. A burning sense of shame filled him. She had to. He thought. Mark looked at the dollhouse, prepared to point out the obviously lit rooms, and stopped. The dollhouse was dark. Completely and utterly dark. Every light was off. But the door was open, as were the windows, and there was a faint smell of cigar smoke in the air. Mark looked down at his sister. She still covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were once more downcast. What happened? He hissed. I heard them, she mumbled. They were having a party. And they were so nice, Mark. They told me I could sit with them. They said I could listen and if I wanted, I could talk to them. Mark took a step back, suddenly nervous. She's going crazy, Mark realized. He had a strange, mingled sense of fear and elation race through him. All his life he had dreamed of being free of her, yet with that possibility in front of him, with the opportunity to put her in a home if he could prove she was a danger to herself and others, he was afraid. What would I do without her here? The concept of being alone, truly alone, without having her to yell at, or to make laugh, sent a chill racing through him. Mark swallowed dryly, then shook the fear off. "Go to the bathroom," he said gruffly. "Clean yourself up. Get some ice out of the freezer and put it on your lip." She nodded, got to her feet, and walked away silently to the bathroom. Mark licked his lips, flexed the bruised and cut knuckles, and stared at the house. After a moment of hesitation, he sat down on the floor in the same place his sister had vacated. "All right," he thought. "Maybe there's some sort of timer. But before I go digging around in the damn thing, I'm going to see if anything happens." Mark settled in and tried to get comfortable. From his seat on the floor, he could hear Cheryl rummage around in the bathroom, then go into the kitchen and get herself some ice. When she left the kitchen, she paused and glanced at him. "Get to your room," he snapped. She did as he said and left him alone with the dollhouse. From his sister's room, he heard the television turn on as he tried to focus on the miniature building in front of him. By the first commercial break, his back began to hurt. Soon, his legs ached, and his knees sent bolts of agony coursing into his spine. He wanted to stand up, to walk around and try to shake off the pins and needles settling into his lower extremities. But he couldn't risk missing the moment, and the dollhouse lights came on. The noise of television became abrasive, each sound causing him to wince. He half heard salesmen and women talk about miracle products, and there was a commercial for a car dealership that caused him to roll his eyes at the nauseating tone of the announcer. And still, the dollhouse remained dark. She did something, Mark thought. Either that or the house does run on batteries, and the damn thing's died. He snorted in disgust. "Yeah, that'd be my luck," he thought. Then the lights came on. Not all at once, but one by one, beginning with the light in the dollhouse's hallway. It was followed by the porch light, then a lamp in the parlor. Lights on the second floor followed, and after those, several more on the first floor flickered into life. Last were the lights in the attic. Mark found himself open-mouthed and staring at the brilliantly lit dollhouse. After several moments, he heard whispers. Not the sound of someone attempting to hide their conversation, but only speech half buried beneath another sound. Mark looked at his sister's door, and he found himself wanting to yell to her to be quiet. "No," he thought, looking back at the dollhouse. "I can't do that. She can't be here. I need to know what this is. How's this happening?" Mark leaned forward and strained his ears. He heard several voices at first, and then more. The gruff tones of men and the sweet, lilting voices of women. Beneath the conversations, Mark could make out the clink of glasses and the soft rasp of silverware on plates. Once again he smelled cigar smoke, mingled with the powerful smell of a fireplace. Mark leaned forward to try and peer in, but a sharp statement and an explosion of laughter caused him to jerk his head back. It took him a moment to realize that the mirth was not directed at him, but at some private joke. And Mark found he wanted to be privy to the conversation. "What the hell am I thinking?" he asked himself. He shook the question away and focused on the dollhouse. Must be a recording of some sort in there. That's the only explanation that makes sense. Yet the statement sounded hollow. There was something more to the noise, a quality of realism that disturbed him. He shivered, goosebumps rising on his exposed skin. A soft squeak and sudden laughter slipped out of the house, both quickly followed by the sound of a stylus being set onto a record. Moments later, the notes of a waltz escaped from the dollhouse and Mark heard a raucous cheer. The curtains on the miniature windows rustled and he swore he could hear the sound of feet dancing. In his mind, Mark visualized couples in stately clothing dancing across a parquet ballroom floor. His heartbeat increased as he stared at the structure, wondering how all the lights were lit. Where the noise was coming from. What powered it all? Holding his breath, he leaned forward and peered into the dollhouse through one of the first-floor windows. He half expected to see well-dressed Victorian couples dancing and dining. But he saw nothing except for well-crafted furniture and paintings. It was as though some artist had copied the inanimate objects exactly, their hands unerringly sure as they created the beautiful pieces. Yet as Mark looked into the dollhouse, he noticed an odd silence. Straightening up, he realized the noise and the music were missing. What the hell? He asked himself. Frowning, he leaned forward again and tried to see a bit of electronics, anything that would give a clue as to the origin of the voices and music he had heard. All that greeted his eye were old weapons hung on the walls. He saw scimitars and sabers, spears and knives, hunting rifles and pistols. Miniature photographs decorated the mantel, and Mark squinted to see the men in the images were all in military uniform. Sitting back once more, Mark shook his head. There's got to be a trigger of some sort, he thought. Maybe a remote control. Hell, I'm not waiting till tomorrow. Mark tried to get to his feet, but he let out a scream of surprise instead. Cheryl stood a short distance away, wearing the threadbare, flannel nightgown she preferred. She had their mother's old shawl around her shoulders, the tassels on it dragging on the floor. Cheryl's hair was tucked under a hairnet, and she looked at him with a strange mixture of dismay and anger. Mark realized that he had never seen those emotions on his sister's face before. You scared me near to death, he grumbled, hiding his fear in a gruff tone. What are you doing? Cheryl asked, looking from him to the dollhouse. I think there are batteries in it, he answered. Got to get them out before they leak. Won't be able to sell it then. There aren't any batteries, Cheryl said, and Mark noticed an oddly satisfied sound to her voice. And you're not going to sell it? He blinked and anger boiled up within him. Who the hell do you think you are, you damned idiot? Mark roared. Look at you. You can't even cook an egg. He started to get to his feet, putting a hand on the wall for support. Cheryl stepped toward him, a bemused smile on her face. You better help me, he snapped, extending his free hand to her. Her smile widened and Mark shouted in surprise, jerking his hand back as something heavy and wet struck the hall floor. What the hell did you hit me with? He demanded. Cheryl's smile remained fixed as she held up what she had hidden beneath the shawl. It was a large bayonet from the First World War. The blade was heavy and thick, the back of it decorated with a vicious serrated edge. A dark, wet liquid dripped from the age-pitted steel and splashed on the floor. Mark looked down and saw his left hand was on the floor. That's mine, he thought dully. My hand. Do I put it on ice, if they can save it? Is that what I do? His attention was drawn away from his body part to the shape of his sister moving in closer. The shawl fell away from her shoulders and there was a gleam in her eyes. A malignant intelligence that was new. You cannot sell the house, she said, slashing at Mark with the blade. He leaped back, slipped on the floor, and went crashing down. His head bounced off the hardwood and he let out a sharp cry of pain. They don't want to go, Cheryl continued. They like me. I don't try to see them. I just like to hear them and to talk to them. They like that. A lot. She smiled. I like to listen to them sing. Isn't that nice? I need a doctor, Mark said, hating the weakness in his voice. Get me some help. She raised her finger to her lips and shushed him. He tried to speak again but she raced forward far faster than he thought possible. Before he could twist away, she crashed to the floor, landing hard on her knees and driving the bayonet into his stomach. His shriek shook the small house, and then the sound died, drowned out by shock and pain as she twisted the weapon several times in his belly. His back arched and he vomited blood and bile into the air. As the liquid splashed back down, splattering the floor and Mark. He tried to see his sister through tear-filled eyes. She was straddling him, her eyes clouded with her dim intelligence. Her head was cocked to one side as if listening to another person. She smiled, nodded, and said, "I have to say goodbye to you now." "Goodbye?" he asked, horrified. "Are you going to get help?" She shook her head. "They don't want me to. They said you aren't a nice person." Cheryl shrugged. "I only have one more job, and then I can listen again." Before he could ask her what it was, his sister grasped the bayonet by its hilt, twisted one more time, and ripped the weapon up and out, most of his intestines going with it. As he lay on the floor, bleeding to death, Mark wept. From the dollhouse, he could hear the sound of people laughing, and of a waltz playing. Next story. The Walk by Sarah Clancy. The morning light pressed through the canopy of leaves, casting a warm glow over the hiking path and glistening off the nearby river. Cassidy adjusted the lens on her camera, bringing her Doberman into focus, and managed to click a shot off while he lunged at a floating log. Despite his efforts, the stick bounced back up to the surface and continued on with the current. Max whirled around and would have followed it had she not used her whistle. Water dripped from his face as he turned to look at her, cocking his head to the side in confusion. Wrong rhythm, she thought to herself with a huff. Letting her camera hang from its strap around her neck, she used both hands to cup the small silver whistle. She blew 3 notes. Low, high, high. Max plopped his rear end in the stream and reared back, his front paws squirming about as he tried to keep his balance. Wrong again. It was one of the things about having an ex-army dog that she should have anticipated before adopting him. While Max was expertly trained and followed every command without delay, he demanded precision. She took a deep breath and blew again. Starting on a high pitch and rising up the scale until it almost hurt her ears. Instantly, Max bolted forward, bouncing through the water and mounting the incline in seconds. Rounding behind her legs, he sat, staring up at her intensely for his next command. After giving him a scratch behind the ears, she was about to motion for him to run on ahead when she heard a twig snap. Sighing, she retrieved his leash from her pocket and clicked it onto his collar. The simple route weaved its way into the forest only to end in a giant loop, effectively ensuring that anyone coming or leaving was going to cross paths eventually. Given his training, Cassidy knew Max wasn't a threat to any of the wildlife. But it was a leashed park. "Sorry, boy," she said, giving him another scratch by way of apology. "I'll let you off again after they loop back." Max accepted the leash without complaint and they both continued down the path. Despite his placid nature, it didn't take much for a Doberman to put people on edge. Especially when they ran into one unexpectedly in the middle of the woods. To prevent any headaches, Cassidy kept a strong grip on the leash and pulled the trotting dog close to her side. The early morning was peaceful. Birds were beginning to stir, the morning dew was starting to warm under the sunlight, and the steady crunch of their footsteps became constant and familiar background noise. She became so relaxed that it took a moment longer for her to notice what was missing. Pausing mid-stride, she turned to look behind them. The path snaked down a slight incline, twisting around thin clusters of trees that never fully blocked the view. There was no one there. They must have turned back, she reasoned. Max tipped his head back to look at her, searching for a sign of what was expected of him. "Guess I didn't leash you fast enough," Cassidy told him. The recognition made his tail whip back and forth. A small gesture of her head had them in motion again. They crossed a small bridge where the crystal water bubbled and frothed over rocks. Stopping to let Max sniff at the abundance of moss, she began to fuss with her camera again. A snapping branch made her head snap up. A few birds slipped through the canopy, shaking a few leaves loose and sending them toppling down. Beyond that, there was no other movement. Sure that she heard it, she slowly twisted around, scanning the lush foliage for any sign of a lurking animal. There weren't supposed to be any large predators in the area, but she knew from experience that they weren't opposed to coming closer to the more trafficked parts. Finding nothing, she passed it off as a squirrel with a little too much enthusiasm and began on her way again. It would take another 15 minutes to reach the final bend, and she was in no hurry to get there. Not when the day was so beautiful and all that waited for her back home was 2 weeks' worth of laundry. Rounding a blind corner, it was a slight surprise to find the woman standing by the side of the path. Cassidy had been there since the break of dawn and no one had passed her. Slowing her pace, she looked the woman over with idle curiosity. Mostly just appreciating the dedication to her fitness. As she walked around the gnarled edges of a fern, she got her first real glance at the woman. Small tendrils of concern began to spark within the pit of her stomach, and it took her a moment to realize why. The early risers tended to come this way for exercise, running the path back and forth before photographers and pet owners like herself could clog up the trail. That usually meant gym gear and jogging shoes. The dress was a little out of the ordinary. Cassidy slowed her pace as she neared. The woman stood on the side of the path, her arms hanging loose by her side. She looked both old and young at once. A strange combination that made it impossible for Cassidy to judge her age. A breeze stirred the long, gray strands of the woman's hair. It was the only part of her entire body that moved at all. Max released a low grumble. The sound didn't draw the woman's attention. Cassidy uneasily inched to the far side of the path, intending to just slip around the stranger and leave her to whatever it was she was doing. When only a few feet separated them, the woman's head snapped up. Wide, milky eyes fixed onto her with unwavering focus. Cassidy stopped abruptly, staring back at the woman. Slowly, the skin of the stranger's cheeks crinkled and rolled, allowing thin lips to peel back and form a twisted, toothy grin. "Hello," the woman said. An unknown accent slurred her words, giving them a sharper hiss on the ends. Cassidy forced a smile as ice trickled down her spine. "Hi," she replied. The woman was silent for a moment. Still, smiling, unblinking. "Hello." The word came out just as it had the first time. Same strange tilt and tempo. Cassidy battled to keep her smile but was quickly losing it. Silence settled upon them like a crippling weight. Nervous energy crackled along her veins, growing stronger as the woman continued to stare. Smiling the entire time. Max's growl continued to roll from him, but he made no attempt to lunge forward. The whole world just came to an abrupt halt. Where is the end of the trail? The stranger's voice made Cassidy shiver. Still, she summoned a polite smile. It's still a bit off. Maybe 15 minutes. I don't want to get lost. Walk with me. Oh. Cassidy struggled to break eye contact, but the woman's whitewashed gaze held her solid. Don't worry. It loops back on itself. Just keep to this path and you'll be fine. She didn't acknowledge the request to walk together. The woman's smile grew impossibly wider. You have to walk with me. Clutching the still growling dog to her side, Cassidy found herself grateful for adopting him as she had. Sweet or not, a snarling Doberman cut a fearsome image. Sorry, Max doesn't like strangers, she lied. The woman didn't spare him a glance. I'll get lost. You can't, Cassidy hurried to assure. There's only one way in and out. Are you going to the end of the path? Yes. The response was instinctive, slipping out of her mouth without thought as she concentrated on bringing Max closer still. Realization smashed into the forefront of her mind as the stranger's grin took on a predatory edge. Good. We can walk together. Lead instantly gathered in the pit of her gut. No. I'm just going to let my dog sniff around for a bit. You go on ahead. The woman returned to her utter stillness, toothy smile still plastered on her face. Despite it all, Cassidy could feel the woman's gaze sharpening. You are going to the end of the path, she said at last. Cassidy nodded. Yes. All the way. Her fingers tightened around Max's leash. She didn't want to answer. But it was clear that the woman was expecting a response. Demanding it. Cassidy wavered under the unseen force and, finally, nodded. Good. I will see you there. Slowly, she turned around and began up the path. Her shoulders didn't move as she trudged onwards. Cassidy watched her go, her knees locked in an instinctive attempt to keep her from following. There was a moment, just before she disappeared around a curve, that she looked back. Despite the distance, Cassidy felt her glare. The stranger's demanding, piercing, predatory glare. Then she was gone. Air escaped from Cassidy's lungs in a solid rush. Without the woman in sight, it was hard to remember what exactly about her had created such an uneasy sensation. She chuckled to herself. At her own stupidity. At the odd situation. At the fact that she had been absolutely terrified by a woman who was probably still tripping on whatever she had taken the night before. Whatever light-heartedness she could summon died when she glanced down at Max. His ears were down, tail tucked firmly between his legs, hair on his neck bristled and shoulders hunched. As he cowered down, it became impossible to ignore the twist in her gut. She felt like an idiot doing it, but she turned around, backtracking her steps. Max gave a final growl and then hurried to follow. In time, the steady crunch of their footsteps against the gravel became a calming sound. Everything was the same as it had been before the strange encounter. The birds chirped and the sun continued to rise. Peaceful and serene. And yet, she still felt that something was off. Enough that she began to pick up her pace. Max was happy to keep up. Together, they weaved down the serpentine trail, past the river and back towards the parking lot. No matter how far they got, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was around her. Close by. Hidden within the trees. Then she heard it. A whistle. Low, high, low. Max instantly sat down, holding his spot even as the leash choked him. Come on, Cassidy urged. Max huffed and got up again, resuming his trotting pace. They got a few feet before a whistle came from the woods. Low, high, low. Once more, Max obediently sat. Cassidy pulled him into motion again, her heart pounding in her chest. All she could think was that the stranger was using Max's obedience as a weapon. Deliberately slowing them down. Keeping them from leaving the woods. But how could she make that sound? Her hand snapped to her pocket, patting it to make sure that she hadn't dropped her silver whistle. While her fingertips found the outline, it wasn't a comfort. The whistle came once more but, this time, Cassidy was ready for it. She talked over the sound, commanding Max in a stern voice to stay by her side. He followed her lead without hesitation. The moment should have felt like a victory. It didn't. Not while she could feel the rage brewing within the eyes upon her. She couldn't shake it and at last gave in. Glancing over her shoulder, she found that the path behind her was just as empty as the way ahead. She was almost back to the start when her tension began to morph into guilt. Images began to creep into her mind, of the woman, possibly a foreigner new to the country, waiting up the path for her to arrive. Biting her lip, she looked over her shoulder again. Her stomach dropped. Through the tangle of leaves, moving towards the corner that would bring them both into the same stretch, she spotted the woman's silver hair. She's following me. It was her. Cassidy broke into a jog, rushing to get around to the security of the approaching twist, desperate to keep herself out of sight. All the feelings she had been dismissing came back in a rush. Silly or not, she ran until there was some good distance between them again. Panting now, she looked over her shoulder. The woman was there. Not running to catch up, but already standing in the center of the path just beyond its curve. Cassidy almost tripped over her own feet in shock. Stumbling to a pause, she was barely aware of Max's low threatening growl. Seconds ticked by, each one adding tension until Cassidy could almost choke on it. Max couldn't take it. His snarls turned to rabid barking. He lunged against his leash, jarring Cassidy from her shock, forcing her to throw her body weight into keeping him back. The woman watched it all unfold with the same twisted smile. Planting her feet and leaning back against Max's pull, she watched the woman closely. The woman's smile began to spread, the flesh rolling up to expose more teeth and bone. They pulled back until the morning light glistened off the slick surface of her exposed cheekbones. Bones cracked and joints popped as the woman crouched down. Not a woman. Not human at all. But something else poised and ready to strike. A sickening crack echoed through the woods as its knees buckled, turning back like a dog, allowing her to hug the ground. In a snap moment, Cassidy knew. The hunt was on. She was the prey. She bolted. The woman, the creature, gave chase. Dust and gravel billowed up behind her as she and Max sprinted down the pathway. She could hear it following. Stomping through the undergrowth and quickly closing in behind her. Pain raced down her legs. Fire burned in her chest. She couldn't keep the pace up for much longer and she knew that she was losing ground. All the while, there wasn't another soul. One more corner and the parking lot came into view. She fished inside her pocket, awkwardly pulling out her keys and clicking the button. The doors unlocked with a flash of her lights. She slammed into the side of the car, scrambling for the door and wrenching it open. But the creature was closer than she had thought. It leaped at her, gnarled teeth bared and hands outstretched. Max's leash snapped as he flung himself at the creature. They collided with a heavy, bone-rattling thud. Feral snarls filled the air as Cassidy forced herself to get into the car. She didn't close the door as she started the vehicle. It roared to life as she reached into her pocket and fished out her whistle. Max yelped before she could give a command for him to come to her. Cassidy's head snapped up to see Max fly a few feet before thumping onto the gravel. The creature turned to face her, smiling in victory, blood dripping from her yellowed teeth. Everything was twisted and monstrous. All but her face. That alone remained human. Cassidy threw the car into gear and stomped down on the pedal. The car lurched forward, bearing down on the monster before it had time to move, the wheels bucking and the engine straining as she drove clear over it. Cassidy screamed as she tugged hard on the wheel, whipping the car around and bringing it up alongside the whimpering Max. Filled with fear, she opened her car door and tried to carry Max into safety beside her. His weight was almost too much for her to hold. He slipped from her grasp as she struggled to pull him in. All the while keeping an eye on the crumbled monster a few feet away. Its hand twitched. Its eyes snapped open. Even with a half-flattened head, it was still grinning. Laughing at her. With one last pull, she dragged Max onto her lap, pulling him into the car just enough for her to close and lock the doors. Blood poured from the monster's mouth, flowing past shattered teeth and bubbling as it began to laugh. Slowly, with the sickening crunch of bones, it began to get up. Go. Barely able to move her legs under Max's heavy weight, Cassidy weaved the car back and forth along the road, apologizing each time a sharp turn made him yelp. I'm sorry, she whispered to him through terrified tears. I'll get you to the vet. You'll be okay. The road brought them out from under the protection of the trees. The blinding light struck her eyes, making her swerve again as she turned and joined the main street. The one that followed alongside the national park. Towering trees loomed over her on her left. But to the right, there were rows and rows of suburbia. Idly patting Max, she couldn't wrap her mind around what had just happened. What she had actually encountered. Horror left her numb, covering her mind until only one thought remained. Her eyes flicked to the family homes and she had to wonder, how long will it be until that woman thing decides to go for a walk? Next story. Wild Child by Sharon M. White. Kayla woke to the trilling of the telephone. The sun was already flooding the bedroom with intense bright light that made her head throb in rhythm with her heartbeat. A heavy arm lay across her waist, pinning her to the mattress like an anchor. She knew whose arm it was as soon as she saw the hand with its spider tattoo between the index finger and thumb. A broken memory flashed in her mind of last night's party at Tony's house. The two of them were steady again and she imagined it would be his arm across her waist on many mornings yet to come. She didn't like being steady with anyone, but Tony threw great parties, and always kept a huge stash of narcotics on hand. Supply and demand makes the world go round. The phone continued to ring, threatening to tear her aching head from her shoulders and liquefy her pulsing eyes. Struggling, she moved Tony's muscle-heavy arm and slid from the bed. She staggered out of the room and down the short hallway, passing the bathroom even though she desperately wanted to go in and take a shower. Anything to rid herself of that grimy, morning-after feeling. In the living room, she said aloud, "Coming already? Geez, give it a rest." She stepped over a couple, snoring and oblivious, on the floor. The boy was Tony's little brother Mark. He had turned 21 and Tony had thrown a hell of a party to celebrate. Mark's girlfriend, already in her mid-30s, lay with her head twisted to the side and her mouth hanging open. A line of drool hung from the corner of her slack mouth. Kayla figured the fake brunette with faker boobs would be gone as quickly as the leftover booze and drugs in the kitchen. Grabbing the phone from the charger, Kayla punched a button and said, "Yeah." The bad connection sounded as if someone were trying to call from Mars. A voice hidden in the crackling, disjointed static answered, but she was unable to understand any actual words. "Hey," she said loudly, "I can't hear you over all the static. You got a bad connection. Find another phone and call back later." She started to plug the phone back to the charger when the connection cleared. An old woman's voice intoned as clear as if she were standing in the room. "You're doing wrong, Kayla Mae Simmons. You clean up and get on home right now, young lady." The line went dead and Kayla slowly set the phone in the charging cradle. Tony walked up behind her, slid his arms around her waist and cupped her left breast, giving it a less than gentle squeeze. "Morning, babe." Who was on the phone? He ran his hands down her stomach and over her hips. When she didn't respond, he asked, "What's wrong?" "Granny just called." Watching the phone as if it might sprout teeth and start gnashing at her, she shivered and crossed her arms over her midsection. Tony laughed as he let his hands roam. "Granny?" He kissed her neck just below her earlobe. "Still my little country mouse. You can take the girl out of the country but she's dead, Tony. She died 2 weeks ago." "What?" His hands dropped away from her and he backed up a step as if she had admitted to having a highly contagious and deadly disease. "Dead. She was in the hospital and she died." Kayla walked past the retro red sofa where 2 young men, whom she did not know, lay tangled together, past the 4 sleeping women sandwiching an older man who grinned in his state of repose amid the rumpled covers of the makeshift bed on the floor. In the kitchen, a half-full bottle of vodka sat on the counter. She drank from it and searched out the baggie that still had an assortment of pills in it. Taking 2 white ones, the names of which she couldn't remember, she swallowed them with the liquor. Tony appeared in the doorway. "There you go. You'll be okay in a few." Nothing like a little hair of the dog to set you right after a badass party. He eyed her up and down suspiciously but made no move to get closer. The nervous grin made him look cow-eyed and stupid. He thought a little hair of the dog would cure anything. Kayla rolled her eyes and placed the bottle back on the counter. Giggles and groans sounded from the living room. Tony smiled and took the bottle and baggie into the other room. There was more laughter, more groans, and some small talk. Kayla lit a cigarette and waited impatiently for the chemicals to kick in and convince her that it had not been her dead grandmother on the phone, it had been a prank or part of a hangover-induced hallucination. This was not the first time something strange had happened after a death in the family. In fact, it wasn't the first time she had seen or heard Granny Simmons since her death, but those were only dreams. At 32, Kayla understood that there was nothing out there after this life. You live, you die, and that was the end of the whole matter. As a child, she had contemplated the existence of an afterlife but failed to find any concrete proof. Only words. Words and stories from preachers with an agenda. Words and stories from well-meaning family members who tried to frighten kids into behaving. And words and stories of demented people who had nothing better to do than sit around devising extravagant tales to make themselves seem interesting, unique and mysterious. Kayla decided years ago that she was going to have as much fun and as many memorable experiences as possible, no matter what. The one thing her family agreed on was that, you only get one life. Better make the best of it. That was exactly what she was doing. What better way to celebrate this one shot at life than partying? That didn't change the fact that dreams didn't make phone calls. Shivering slightly, she doused her cigarette in the sink. Feeling the first twinges of a buzz coming on, Kayla started toward the bathroom, wanting to lay claim to the shower before anyone else got the same idea. As she walked by, the older man on the floor sat forward, snagged her shirt tail with one hand, reached the other under the long garment and grabbed her bare ass. Hey, why don't you join us for a little wake-me-up romp? He tugged her shirt hard enough to make her stumble. Smiling, she leaned down close to his face and took one of his hands. You want me to? She traced his index finger with the tip of her tongue. Yeah. He patted a spot on the floor in front of him, between his legs. Arching her eyebrows, she touched the tip of her tongue to the tip of his middle finger. When he nodded and gave her a licentious grin, she wrapped her fingers around his pinky finger and, still smiling, snapped it backward until she heard the bone snap. In the midst of his surprised and agonized wail, she shoved him backward, toppling him onto the floor, and said, "Don't ever touch me again." The man gripped his wounded hand to his chest and screamed, "I'll kill you for that." He struggled to gain his feet but Tony intervened, pushing the man down to the floor again. "Ron, I think it's time for you to leave, man. Just get your crap and go." Tony lifted a lamp and produced a small, black handgun from an indention in the table. He didn't brandish it at Ron, and Kayla knew it probably wasn't even loaded. Ron, angry, and in pain, grabbed his clothes and began to dress on his way out. Kayla walked to the bathroom, letting the stunned silence trail behind her like a wedding veil. The drugs and booze had set in, allowing a slightly numb feeling to wash over her body and, best of all, her brain. It was easier now to determine that the phone call had been only her imagination, or maybe a leftover dream that had still been playing out in her head. Maybe someone was trying to reach Tony and had a bad connection. She thought little about Ron as she turned on the shower and waited for the water to run warm. As a teenager, she had learned how to protect herself, and as a woman, she had found the best defense against perverts like Ron was to have a man like Tony, tough, full of ego, and willing to do anything to keep her as his own. Exasperated with the terrain into which her thoughts dragged her, Kayla stepped into the shower, sighing as the warm water sloughed off the remains of the party. She took her time showering, relishing the otherworldliness of the steam and water making her clean again. When the water ran cool against her back, she turned it off and opened the curtain to a densely fogged room. She thought of London in the grip of a Victorian fog, a scene she had undoubtedly seen in a movie or read about in a book. As she was drying her hair with the towel, the vinyl shower curtain rustled, and her body stiffened. The smell of lavender, thick in the humid air, flooded her sinuses. She could taste that purple scent. The shower curtain opened, and her grandmother stood there in her tattered burial shroud. Kayla tried to suck in breath enough to scream, but instead, she felt as if she were suffocating. Granny Simmons's burial shroud hung limp and wet against her body. Dirt turned to mud in the dampness of the bathroom air and slowly crept down the front and sides of the once white material. A straggle of hair hung against her forehead in a dirty crescent. Her bare, torn arms sagged against her sides, free of the winding shroud. Granny stepped out of the shower and her bare feet slapped the tile floor with a sickening sound. Kayla backed into the locked door, unable to scream, unable to form cohesive thoughts. Granny raised one withered hand, pointing a dirty, crooked finger at Kayla. "Go home, Kayla May. You need help to clean up your ways. This ain't the way you were raised." Kayla shook her head and tried to tell Granny that she neither needed nor wanted any help, but the words stuck in her throat. Granny moved forward, her skinny, dead feet sliding along, leaving a muddy trail. Kayla had nowhere left to go. She dared not move forward enough to open the door and escape. Granny stood a foot from Kayla. The odor of lavender so pungent it made her gag. Her empty sockets seemed to see more than eyes ever could, and the withered skin of her sallow, sunken cheeks stretched taut as she leaned forward, nearly touching Kayla's nose with her own. "I said go home." This time the air wheezed into Kayla's lungs, and she screamed. Pressing both hands over her face so she couldn't see Granny anymore, she screamed until silver specks swam behind her clenched eyelids. The knob rattled at her back and she screamed again, dropping her hands from her face. Scanning the room, the only proof of Granny were the muddy smears from her grave-dirty feet and smudges on the tiny window above the toilet where she had apparently exited nimbly and silently. Tony yelled from the hallway and the knob rattled again, that was quickly followed by a thump that rattled Kayla's teeth together. She moved away from the door just as the striker plate gave way and the door slammed into the wall. Tony, wide-eyed and red in the face, ran into the steamy bathroom and grabbed Kayla by the shoulders. He looked into her eyes and gave her a little shake. "What's wrong? Why'd you scream like that? Was it Ron?" He moved to the tiny window and tiptoed to look out. Without bothering to cover her nakedness, Kayla ran from the bathroom, down the hall and into the bedroom. She pulled on sweats and a tank top, grabbed her small purse and keys, and left the room. She ran into Tony in the doorway. "What the hell is going on, Kayla? Where are you going?" She swiped at her hair, looked around the room quickly and said, "Granny was in there, Tony. She came out of the shower and left through the window. I have to go home." "Something's wrong." "Yeah, probably shouldn't have mixed those pills with the vodka for starters." He put his hands on her waist. "Come on, babe, it's just hallucinations. You're fine. No dead grandmothers here." He kissed her. "I'll even check under the bed for you if you stay." He grinned. Kayla shoved his hands away. "I'm glad I could be your little comedy relief. I'm leaving, and I don't know when I'll be back. You're just tripping. I'm telling you, you're going to feel like an idiot come tomorrow when all this is over." She ran past him, through the people in the living room and out the front door. Tremors shook her as she drove, and she continually checked the rear view expecting to see Granny in the back seat. The half-hour drive from Tony's house on Church Street to her little house on West Hawley took almost an hour. Navigating the skinny, winding road was difficult with her shaking hands and arms. The farther from Tony's she drove, the fewer homes she passed, making her wonder if it had been a wise decision to leave the comfort of her beau's house. She did not fancy the idea of being alone. And after some consideration, she fancied the idea of explaining herself to the others at Tony's house even less. The calming serenity of Adams County turned on Kayla and was no longer the beautiful, inviting landscape she'd grown to love. The trees on either side of the road seemed ragged and threatening. Things moved within the shadows, living things that should not be. The familiar mountain road changed into a path through a land where nightmares lived and roamed. More than once, Kayla braked as dark things scurried into the roadway, and though she never saw with great detail, she knew what they were. Similar to Granny, they trailed tattered shrouds and left muddy footprints on the cracked asphalt. She laughed and cried simultaneously, thinking about the people these dead things would visit. How many people will look up from some everyday chore and see a ragged, long-dead family member standing in the room? Will these people go mad, or like me, just run away? Then again, maybe all this is just a drug-induced hallucination, no more real than a nightmare. Parking the car so the front bumper nearly touched the siding, Kayla clutched her purse and keys, and climbed out. At the front door, she fumbled her key into the lock. Every puff of a breeze sounded like Granny whispering at her back. She was in a full panic by the time she turned the key and pushed the door open. The house was isolated near the end of Holly Road, and her closest neighbor was so far away that he couldn't hear her if she screamed until her lungs burst. The first thing she did was call her mother. She spilled the story as quickly as possible and waited for her mother's comforting voice and words of wisdom to soothe her fears. Instead, Kayla heard a dramatic feminine sigh and then, "Honey, are you using again? Why can't you clean up your act? You know this is just your guilty conscience because this isn't how you were raised. Or maybe it's God trying to get your attention." Frustration and fear hammered away at Kayla's tenuous hold on her composure. No one understood. Granny had not been an illusion, a dream, or hallucination. "Mom, hallucinations don't leave muddy footprints on the floor or smell like Granny's funeral flowers." She walked through the living room, flipped on the bathroom light and checked behind the shower curtain. "No, they don't. God's showing your wrongs to you. He wants you to get right, you know." "You're saying that God scared the hell out of me?" Kayla closed her eyes and flipped on the kitchen lights. "Oh, Kayla. Don't make a joke out of everything." Her mother's exasperated tone made Kayla's brain itch. She'd been hearing that all her life, and it was always directed at her. "I'm not trying to, Mom. I know what's real, whether you believe me or not." She checked her bedroom. It was empty. She relaxed a little and sat on the edge of her bed. That soft sigh again. "You never did answer me." Here it came. She was going to start on about the drinking and drugs, give her the guilt trip and make her feel like a miserable hump of flesh that was wasting air and taking up space, tell her how her life was such a waste and make her feel lower than dirt on a snake's belly. She returned the sigh. "What question? Are you using again? Are you drinking and taking drugs again? No one can help you if you don't tell the truth." Kayla dropped her purse onto the chest of drawers as she went out of the room. She was going to go to the kitchen, pour a glass of iced tea, and light a cigarette. Kayla froze at the kitchen's doorway, nearly dropping the phone. Muddy smears streaked the happy yellow and green linoleum. The smears started at the back door, curved around the edge of the kitchen table and disappeared at the entrance to the living room. When she didn't answer immediately, Kayla's mother repeated her question more forcefully. Whispering and enunciating carefully as if to a toddler, Kayla said, "Mom, someone is in the house." "What?" "Speak up, honey, I can't hear you." "Your father is running the Mom," she said a little louder, "I think Granny is here. Muddy prints on my floor. Please come over quick." She wanted to hang up the phone about as much as she wanted to drill a hole in her own head, but she saw no other choice. Pushing the button to disconnect the call, Kayla leaned against the table, trying to see into the living room without actually getting close to it. The back door squealed as the frame and the door melded together, forming a seamless wall. Kayla's heart fluttered in her chest and sweat dampened her palms and underarms. The front door and then the windows made the same high-pitched squealing sound. No, no, no. You leave me alone. Just go away. She put her hands over her ears, trying to block out what sounded like hogs being castrated. Dropping to her knees, Kayla prayed aloud. Please, God, if it's the drugs and booze, I'll never do it again. Just make this stop. Please, I'll straighten up, I promise. Tears streamed down her face as she crossed herself like she had seen in movies. Her family had never been Catholic, but she thought it couldn't hurt and crossed herself again. When the smell of lavender drifted to her nostrils, she squealed and scurried backward until she hit the wall that had been, until recently, a door. Granny walked across the linoleum, her empty sockets seeming to glare underneath her knitted eyebrows. Her mouth was turned down into a frown. Kayla pleaded with the animated corpse. Please stop, Granny. Please just go away and leave me alone. Please. Granny nodded. All in due time. She took another step and braced against the table. We're going to help you, Kayla. No, Granny. Honestly, I can do this on my own. I promise. I just promised God and, you don't back out of a promise to God. She felt a maniacal grin split her tear-streaked face and nodded. I'll be good from now on, you'll see. I don't need help. She shook her head for emphasis. Another smell pervaded and strangled out the sickening lavender. This second odor was thick, dark and sulphurous. It stung her eyes and made her cough. Shaking her head and scrambling to the corner, she tried to make her way to the bedroom where she might put a door between herself and Granny. A low rumble like far-off thunder rolled through the house. It vibrated through her breastbone and the fine bones of her face. The air hung heavy and charged all around her. What's that, Granny? You need to go, right? They're calling you back. She was hopeful. Granny shook her head and stood up straight, removing her hands from the table and clasping them in front of her stomach as she had in life. This was her waiting pose. Heavy footsteps sounded in the living room. A man's footfalls, thudding and pronounced against the hardwood flooring, moved toward the kitchen. Kayla recognized her Uncle Jack as soon as he appeared. He had died of a drug overdose when Kayla had been only 17. Some believed he was murdered. Kayla's tears stopped, her trembling ceased, and her heart skipped a few beats. She shook her head and scrubbed at her face with her fingertips. No. You're not real. Hallucinations. Not real. The sulfur and lavender mixed into a vomit-inducing stench, and she dry-heaved as her two dead family members stepped closer to her. Why? She looked up at them and heaved again. Granny said, because you're on the wrong road. Jack intoned, because we love you, sweet pea. He stepped closer to Granny and they stood shoulder to shoulder in front of Kayla. And because we can help you. No one helped me, and you don't want to know what it's been like for me on the other side. I won't see you there. Not if I can help it. Kayla looked at him again, this time holding her breath and squinting her eyes against the sting of the sulfur. His skin was charred and blackened. As she watched, tiny blue flames burst to life in several parts of his body. Smoke swirled from the holes, which healed over quickly with leathery flaps of skin that made him look akin to a macabre patchwork quilt. The flames would disappear only to reappear elsewhere. Flames lit up his empty eye sockets, and she cringed. Granny moved to the corner with Kayla and sat beside her. "There's a wild child inside you, honey. We'll take her out and you'll be right as rain." She patted Kayla's bare shoulder. "You'll see. Jackie only needs you to open your mouth so he can get inside and hunt down that little misbehavior." Kayla stared at Uncle Jack. He wasn't completely solid. "No. You can't do this to me." She shot forward and up, grabbing a chair. She swung the chair at Granny. There was a crunching sound as the side of Granny's head caved in and thick, brackish fluid oozed down her cheek. Granny struggled to her feet. Her bottom jaw unhinged and hung at an awkward angle. Kayla darted into the bedroom and tried to shut the door. It was no longer separate from the wall. Uncle Jack and Granny slowly made their way into her bedroom. She was trapped. Kayla slid on her belly under the bed. A small hand clamped around her ankle and dragged her out. She kicked and thrashed, but Granny's grip was tight. "I know you're scared, but this will be a lot easier on us all if you just calm down. We're only here to help." Jack spoke from the doorway, his voice beginning to sound hollow and thin. With Granny pinning Kayla to the floor, Jack stepped forward. "Get her mouth open. I only got one shot at this." Kayla gritted her teeth. Granny clamped a hand over Kayla's lower face and dug a thumb into one side of her jaw and fingers into the other. Her jaw burned and pained as if they were being torn loose. As soon as her mouth popped open, Jack morphed into a wispy form, insubstantial as smoke, and funneled down Kayla's throat. He was inside her, winnowing and coiling through her tissues and around her organs. The paralyzing pain was worse than anything she had ever endured. She only hoped he would be done quickly, or that she would die soon. When he moved to her head, still searching, the pressure reached the exploding point behind Kayla's eyes and in her sinuses. Just as she decided her eyeballs were going to be pushed out of their sockets, Kayla's stomach muscles clenched, and she made a yerk sound. Granny moved out of the way and Kayla rolled her head to the side, gagged again, and then heaved. The spasms were so violent that she was yanked into a sitting position. Between heaves, she managed to get to her knees. Something ripped and tore at her stomach and then her throat. Breathing was impossible as her lungs collapsed and her throat filled. Uncle Jack, in his vaporous form, rolled from her mouth. As soon as his feet touched the floor, he became more solid again. His hands were still inside her mouth and she could feel him pulling, tugging something free that didn't want to be freed. Granny yelled, "Get her, Jackie. Pull her out. You can do this, get her." She turned to Kayla. "Girl, you fight and get this thing out of you." She wrapped her arms around Kayla's waist and walked backward with her. Uncle Jack screamed as a mass of long, matted black hair cleared Kayla's mouth. Kayla clawed at the mass, trying to scream. Then it was out. Dangling from Uncle Jack's fist. Kayla spat and sputtered blood and bile onto the floor. A pervading calmness coursed through her body and mind. A foreign feeling, but one she liked. The thing was a tiny version of Kayla. It screeched and flailed at the air with its skinny arms and yellowed nails. Uncle Jack laughed and shook it side to side. "Just thought you were rooted and good, huh?" He looked at Kayla and said, "You're safe now. The wild child's out and you're free." Granny cleared her throat and spoke with her oddly twisted and broken face, "The child is yours, Kayla. We took her out, but you gotta keep her. We can't take her away, she's part of you. What am I supposed to do with it? I don't want it." The calmness was still with her, and she hoped it would stay forever. Uncle Jack opened his fist and the tiny, humanoid wildling hit the floor in a heap, screamed and ran straight for Kayla. It jumped onto her chest and began ripping at her face, growling. Kayla flung it against the wall. It looked like an emaciated child with its bones pricking up at its stretched skin, partially rotted and broken teeth, and a feral look in its eyes. It hunkered at the wall for a moment and then stalked, like a cat on the hunt, back toward Kayla. Holding out her hand, she said firmly, "No. You can't get back inside." Their eyes locked and Kayla shook her head. No, Granny and Uncle Jack were gone and the doors were only doors again when Kayla turned to plead with them to take the demon away. The thing whimpered. Kayla saw the sadness in its eyes and pity welled up in her chest unbidden. The trembling of its limbs as it reached for her and the mewling sound it made when her expression softened brought a tear to her eyes. Trying to ignore its pleas and begging, Kayla went into the bathroom, took a washcloth and cleaned up as best she could. She donned another pair of sweats and a shirt that was much too large. The thing followed her, down on its hunkers. It was crying, the heartbreaking sobs of a child who has suffered something terrible at the hands of a loved one. Unable to deny her feral spawn any longer, she bent and scooped it from the floor, amazed at how tiny and fragile it was in her arms. It weighed no more than a loaf of bread. She stroked its hair and it nuzzled closer, wrapping those tiny, insignificant arms around her neck. The action tugged at Kayla's heartstrings and she thought she loved the creature. Just a little at first but growing with each minute that she held the demon close. Kayla thought she would do anything for the trembling child in her arms, to keep it happy and safe. Hopefully, it wouldn't be anything terrible.